Well, welcome everybody. Tonight we are speaking with Neil Gordon, and I'll give you a brief introduction. Neil is a reader in computer science at the University of Hull. He has research interests at the interface of mathematics with computer science, particularly in the areas of finite geometry and its applications and informal approaches. He is also an advocate for the effective development and use of technology for teaching, especially in higher education, and he has worked on several projects with AdvanceHE. He was one of the early researchers in the topic of teammate peer assessment, which is dear to our heart, as a way to improve group work. And his most recent journal article addresses the issue of how to effectively improve student employability skills. So Neil, welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Peter. Nice to speak to you. I'm speaking from England, so it's a morning here. Yeah, I've been interested in the area of how we can prepare students for their future lives, really. So my own background was mathematics and computer science, and I've worked at the interface of those disciplines, using computers to teach mathematics, teaching maths to computer scientists, and kind of inspired by both those things, looking at technology in teaching more generally, and particularly in, say, higher education. One of the things I've been interested in is the sort of professional and sort of wider development of our own students. So I've been involved with the British Computer Society here in the UK, which is our sort of IT industry-focused organisation that also helps us, informs what we teach in our courses. So as part of that, I was looking at things around the wider aspects of computing beyond the technical things like ethics, professional responsibility, and the kind of skills that people need to actually function in life and in work. And sometimes in technical subjects, I think we sort of end up focusing on the technical aspects. I know my own maths degree, I did a joint maths computer science degree. In mathematics, it was entirely about doing maths by yourself. There was no group work, there was no real written work. It was equations and things. In computing, it tends to be writing software, solving problems yourself. Again, it's very technical, and they were good for learning and understanding of discipline. But at the end of the day, they gave you no real skills to actually work with anybody else, or actually probably apply your skills usefully. Now, that was some time ago when I was an undergraduate, but as things have evolved, there's been more encouragement through things like the organisations that define syllabus, that we should have kind of soft skills or key skills, as they've been called over the years. And one of the things I've come across was that need to, how do we do that effectively? So when I first became a lecturer in computer science, I was asked to teach a module that had notionally sort of ethics and professional skills and use of IT within it, but most of that there was no formal material for teaching that. And similarly, there was no real emphasis on any aspect of teamwork. I thought that sort of seemed odd. So I began developing more formal approaches to those different aspects and introducing teamwork, as I could see, as one of the required soft skills or key skills we're supposed to develop, but we were missing it. For me, there was sort of, I suppose, three aspects to that. One aspect was my teaching was evolving as we found that computing was growing rapidly. So my early teaching experience as a new teacher with no teaching training was teaching classes of 30 or 40. And as computing was rapidly growing, they went from to a 60 to 80 to 100, 150, 200. And a lot of the assessment methods we were using weren't really appropriate. And a beneficial thing would be to utilise things like teamwork, where students could work together, support each other, and I could focus on supporting teams, which was manageable in a scalable way, as well as being practically useful. Again, early on, I was using sort of manual approaches to do that. So I would use things like spreadsheets to collect data from students about what they were doing. Again, early on, I identified the concerns many students had of teamwork, about the problems they perceived around fairness. So we said, well, if we all get the same mark, how's that fair if we've done different work within it? And again, it's one of those debates you can have about, well, in practice, in kind of the outside world, you'll work on team deliverables, and how well the product does is how you all are rewarded in a sense. But equally, there's recognition of individual work normally in the real world, in the outside world. So look at how we might do that in our teaching and our team activities. So with small groups, you could do that by, say, manual mechanisms, so sort of paper-based things. So the students have to submit a team activity. They could fill in a short form of their names and how much they all perceive they've contributed. And again, with the smaller modules and numbers, that was quite manageable. It had its own, again, challengeable aspects. So one thing is, I encourage students to get together as a team and discuss what they'd all done, and then try and allocate a proportion of the product to each member, and it should be 100% total. Now that made it easier for me to manage that way, but it required the people to get together and chat and agree. And again, that sometimes had problems where people couldn't agree. So I had to get involved with talking to them all and trying to negotiate an outcome that was deemed fair, and you could justify it. So as I was sort of wrestling with that challenge, and as I say, the module sizes were increasing in numbers, I came across technologies that could enable that. So I'd used technologies in other aspects of teaching before. The one at the time that was available in my own institution was one called WebPA. That was part of a JISC project here in the UK. So JISC are the Joint Information Systems Committee, I think we're called, but they provide project funding for innovative projects. So WebPA came on a project between Loughborough and Hull University. It was based in biochemistry at the time at Hull. And they were looking at doing teamwork and how you could assess that or support it with technologies that could gather information about relative contribution. And that fitted with my sort of model as well. So I began to investigate using it. We had a version working at the institutions. We were one of the developing institutions. I found that was quite useful. It let you separate out gathering the data about students' contributions to team activity from the actual sort of face-to-face aspect. So they could do it notionally independently of one another. It gave you some scoring to be able to weight to some extent the marks individuals got. And again, there's lots of challenges with that. I tended to always do moderation of it based on other evidence. But that was a way we introduced sort of peer scoring of team projects. And there was often a lot of confusion on peer assessment itself. People confuse peer assessment of students marking each other's work as opposed to sort of scoring or weighting contribution to a group activity. So these were group activities where the teams were producing one or two or more deliverables. I wanted to know roughly some indication of how much each person was contributing to that team activity. So WebPA provided a way to manage that early on. I adopted that in initially some first year teaching I was doing with these sort of team projects, team skills, and other skill development. And as a kind of a model for assessment and teaching, I thought that was seemed a useful approach. I could set students more challenging and realistic problems. So I think nowadays tend to call that authentic assessment. I tried to set problems in ways that let students subdivide it so they could base it on their skill sets and interests. So I tried to have problems that were big enough that you couldn't easily do it as an individual. It really had aspects that you could separate out, some of them quite easily, so that individuals who wanted to be more independent could do that and contribute to the collective. Other aspects that required 2 or 3 people to work on them together, so that the defining a problem became important, but then the marking was marking what the team produced in its deliverable or set of deliverables, and then use that peer scoring, peer weighting approach to then give them some individual marks. So having used it in sort of first year material, I've then adopted it for second year and third year modules. Again, depending on sort of education systems here in the UK, we tend to use second and third year or fourth year, if it's an integrated master's, to define the class that a student gets in the degree.
Yeah.
So often colleagues are willing to innovate in first year modules because it's a progression issue, but it doesn't matter to the student's classification. Whereas when it came to things in second year, and particularly the third year or fourth year, which heavily influence what degree classification the student gets, people are quite reluctant to innovate, and they get worried about how you deal with student complaints or appeals.
Yeah.
And often end up defaulting to an end of module exam or an individual piece of coursework. And again, I didn't think that seemed a rational approach myself. If you choose it first year, but use it throughout, provided you can evidence it with again, these sort of peer scoring systems, whichever tool you're using, and have mechanisms to let students raise issues. So always have clear guidance to students on how we can raise issues before they submit, as they submit. I emphasize it's done then, not after they see what score they get and then complain. So there's other mechanisms for that if they feel there's been an unfair academic process. But try and put that in place, and then you could do it at all levels. So I've used it in final year, third year modules, and in MEng fourth year modules as well. And again, a similar sort of approach. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Did you get student pushback?
Very rarely. So, I've used it myself across several modules at every level for, say, a couple of decades now. So I've had thousands and thousands of students go through that. I've had one or two students complain about having to do group work at all, but not about the scoring. Less so than colleagues. I've some colleagues in teamwork where they just give a team score still. So not everyone has adopted that approach, and they do get quite a lot of complaints.
Yeah.
We also get complaints though on individual work where students don't understand quite what we're doing on the marking. So I think I've seen many student complaints over the years, but I've not had any direct complaints about using peer weighting and team projects in that way. Because I've always tried to frame it in a way where the students understood early on what was happening. They had some choices and some sort of ownership of it. And they had a clear mechanism to raise any issues they had. And so I adopted that, say, in various modules where something like e-commerce, commercial game development, and other modules where we could find authentic problems for students to work on, biggish problems, but ones where they could subdivide it, they could understand what we're doing, and they did some form of peer scoring at the end.
Yeah.
Again, as part of that, sorry.
No, I was going to say, so Neil, that's where we at least heard of you first, right? Because your journal article was, I think that was from 2015, in which you wrote up about how peer assessment was used to engage students in group learning. Yes,
that's right. Yeah.
So, and that's fantastic. But what caught our eye was recently that you also authored a paper that was near and dear to our hearts here, because it was around solving a problem that I think is significant, which is how do you ensure that graduates have those employability capabilities when they finish. And so that's what we've been working on. And when we saw your work, we went, well, geez, that Neil, he's also working on that. And it sounds like, well, you came up with a great solution. And so let's start talking about that. But why don't you set the scene and talk about where the skills gap is. You can, and again, your frame of reference is going to be the UK, and it's going to be around computer science. But I think it's applicable to other areas, not just computer science. And I'm sure, well, I know that it's also applicable to places like North America, Australia, New Zealand. So what's the skills gap that you're finding?
So it is, obviously, you mentioned my college is UK, but I'm aware of computing education generally. So there's a lot of similar issues in global computing education and more widely. and it is around these, what I call sort of the soft skills. Let's say in the UK, we call them key skills. So it's some of the things which people need to be able to, I suppose, function generally, is one sense, whether it's in paid work, in voluntary work, in any aspect of career or personal development, really, where you want to work with other people and demonstrate how you can communicate, coordinate, and organize, manage things like time. Also be able to do some of that negotiations and agreements with people. So I think anytime you have these sort of social interactions, it creates challenges. I guess most of us work in departments with colleagues, and we know the challenges you get with that. And over time, you develop mechanisms to deal with things and how to work with people. But it seems to be missing often in university courses.
I was going to say, was it a fair assumption or a fair statement to say that collectively we're failing at teaching students these valuable skills, right? That we're good at subject matter, but outside of that,
I think it is very fair. Yeah, I know it's one of those things where it's common across disciplines. I've been involved with those projects of looking at teaching generally in HE. Worked with colleagues here in the UK and overseas across a range of disciplines, and it's very common in many disciplines that although they talk about wanting to develop team skills and soft skills, when you look at actually what they teach and the way they assess, that's not visible. So there's a tendency, we'll talk about encouraging students to discuss and explore things and social interaction. And you say, well, where is that? And they say, well, it's in seminars. And again, going back, I think you mentioned about these things aren't necessarily, they're not being taught explicitly, and they're excluded from assessment. So we sort of tell the students, it's important you can do this, but we won't really explain it to you.
Yeah.
And we'll ask you about it afterwards in a way that matters to you. So, I mean, one thing I've looked at from an assessment perspective is if you offer students optional kind of formative things, so things we say are helpful and we should help you develop your knowledge, but it's not essential, it's formative, then student engagement with that can drop off massively. I think, again, it might depend partly on disciplines and on the size of cohorts you're working with. And potentially, I think, again, this COVID era, whether it's face-to-face or remote teaching, my own experience in computing is if you say something's formative to students and you've got large classes where you can't talk to them individually about how you've done it, then majority don't. So you see sort of formative activities where 90% don't ever try it. Whereas if you make it summative and it's part of your assessment, 90% will do it. And you get that sort of that switch. If it's assessed, even if it's worth very little, you say, well, this assessment's worth 1%. In essence, it won't actually matter to what you get, but it's worth something on a module. If you do it, we'll count it towards your classification on the module and your degree. They do it. If you say, well, it's important that we have this skill and we'd like you to do it, but it's not essential. They say, well, it's not essential, then I'll ignore it, thank you. And I think that's the issue with staff, that if staff say, well, I can't see how to assess this thing, it seems complicated, I'm a bit worried about it, or I'm unfamiliar with it, the easiest thing for staff is not to do it. And I think that's where we're failing, that colleagues are allowed to get away with that. Institutionally, we allow that to happen. Collectively, it is common. So I think there's good practice, obviously, in the sector, as many people do good assessments. They do introduce and support these activities, tools like your own, projects like your own, things I've done and others have done. It can be done, but it's, I think, where people have time pressures, again, in higher education across the world, I think most teaching staff aren't purely teaching staff. They've got other pressures. If you ask them, well, do you want to think about this problem and solve it, or simply set an exam or set this coursework? The default of the quicker thing for me is just to set the exam. And I can say you should do this thing, but if I don't actually assess it, it's easier for me. The students won't complain. And if no quality systems, no checking systems say, well, how come you're not doing it? then staff don't do it. So you see courses where students aren't developing any of these soft skills, but when we graduate, they're the skills that employers are saying we need these skills.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the paper you mentioned, one of the reasons we looked at that approach to in the master's year here at Hull for our integrated masters was to make sure the students were developing skills that get them jobs as software developers. Because we realised that we give them technical knowledge, we teach them modules around advanced aspects of software engineering, computer graphics. They can do technical things, but when we go for a job interview, the companies will assume that because we've got a degree in computer science. What the company will say to me is, can you explain to us what matters about what you've done, or tell us about how you work with other people. And if they couldn't do that, they weren't getting jobs. And I think that's where these kind of inspiration, if you like, for that, having authentic-based problems and looking at getting students to reflect upon what did it involve in that problem. Because again, in many software engineering and many disciplines, we know to create some sort of solution. And we could grade purely the solution, but in a way that's not too critical because often we scaffold it in such a way we know the students can create a working solution.
Yeah.
So sometimes we're marking our own guidance to them on how to solve a problem.
Yeah.
So what we thought would be better would be to look at, get them to think about what have you done? What did you benefit from this? What was a challenge? How did you deal with someone who wasn't being productive? Or, you know, if you had a clash of personalities, how do you deal with that? Again, a lot of these things they're not discipline specific. They're about any problem of working with others.
Yeah.
I mean, say even in terms of the software engineering side of our problems, so the paper you mentioned earlier, the students are learning to work with, say, with clients, ideally industrial ones, so people outside university. Many of the problems our students work on actually are for clients inside our institution. So we have, as computer scientists, we help solve some of the software problems on campus so that they deal with that, but it's still working with that person as a client who wants a problem solving. So we have to understand, how do you talk to someone who's not setting you an academic problem? They're telling you, here's my problem. Can you identify how to solve it? And then we have to work through how you work with that client, how you talk to them to understand their problem sufficiently. You can try and solve it. Look at how we solve it as a discipline, as software engineers or as programmers. But then the thing we're getting to look at routinely and we assess them on is their reflection on how they managed that process, how we did it, how they applied their prior knowledge in solving this sort of problem. So I've used it in other modules before, but yeah.
Yeah, Neil, can you? So this is we're dancing around. So the problem that you identified and we're all aware of is that soft skills gap. And so you and a colleague said, right, we've got a solution for this, and this is going to be at a postgraduate level. We're going to create a capstone course to solve this problem. Give us some specifics about the capstone course, because I think it's brilliant.
Okay, so my colleague Dr. John Dixon, he leads that module and has for several years. It's one we introduced into our master engineering degree. So here in the UK, we have 4-year integrated master's courses. So it's an undergraduate degree, but it finishes at master's level. We expect within that the students do 2 years of the low level learning, go into the 3rd year where they'll do an individual project. And in the 4th year, they're learning more advanced topics and should do something which is a significant project. So partly inspired by the requirement of our accrediting body, so BCS talk about having projects and team activities important, and this need for soft skills. As we designed that degree, say many years ago, we put in a team activity into the 4th year. It's going to take a 1/3 of that 4th year's learning. So the students spend a 1/3 of their time on this. And as I say, we wanted to focus on creating students who could take their technical knowledge and as they graduate, be able to apply it. So it was designed as a commercial development practice module, which would be focusing on applying skills to solve real world problems.
So you were working with real businesses. So how many students did you have that were taking the course in over any given semester? How, so I'm interested in the kind of the size of the teams, and then how many businesses then did you have to coordinate with?
So the early stages of this module, we had a benefit that at a similar times as developing that route, we had an internal software development house, which was doing some real world software development. Initially, it was designed to help deal with a problem that computer science graduates couldn't get jobs. So although the industry was saying we're desperate for computing experts, computing wasn't getting them jobs. So that's still the case in the UK, where
Wow.
as a discipline, we have the worst employability rate.
Wow.
As a discipline. Now, apparently that's because there's many computing degrees that don't give students the necessary computing skills and soft skills to get a job. So we had this software house developed as part of a project to offer short-term internships to students who could graduate from any university in the UK, and they could come to us for, and again, the plan originally was for up to 3 months of short-term experience, like a short-term internship, and then they'd be able to use that to help get a job. So we had that developed as part of the project already. The problem we found with that project actually was that students, as they started to work on projects with us, they could then get jobs. So the churn in the students was so high, we had trouble actually doing the projects we got.
Yes.
Because they'd arrive and get a job.
Yeah.
Which is when what inspired us to, at that point, to build it in as a module in a course. So rather than having it as something where they could come and go as they wished, we put in a control mechanism, which we'll have a similar model, but as a 40 credit module running over 2 semesters for students who then are going to be on a degree. At least we know then we've got them for that time period.
Yeah.
So the early stages of this module were based on that model, where we had an internal software house. We had a commercial software manager who was running the software house, but also acted as a kind of a client and manager for the module, alongside an academic manager for the teaching and assessment side. So the early stages were built around that. For a variety of reasons, that software house moved out of our area. As it became successful, it was better to run it as a company and spin it out. That created kind of a gap, if you like, though, for our module, which is around the time that John was taking over the module. And so at that point, we decided that the way forward then was to look at working with some of the clients we'd had before as potential clients to employ a separate commercial sort of consultant manager to come in to give the students experience of working with a industrial related person alongside academic management that my colleague John was doing. And in terms of the numbers, I say in that period, the module was kind of, I suppose, ebbed and flowed in its size, and that affects the number of teams we've run and the number of projects. Partly because of the way that funding works. In the UK, funding for master's level and for integrated masters has altered in terms of its relative attraction. I think our biggest cohort was only 30, and smallest is around 10. So typically we run between team sizes are typically 4 or 5 students per team, and they so we had between sort of 2 or 6 or 7 teams typically, which means needing 6 or 7 live industrial projects. We have a range of companies we work with, as well as saying internal parts of the institution. So our ICT area, student services, students union have all come to us in the past with projects. But also we worked with large external bodies and local small companies. So in the area Hull's based, we have a digital innovations company or institute not far away. So we have lots of companies in there that have come to us with ideas for projects. There's academics on campus have done as well, but also other organisations, so large companies and large government organisations So in recent years, done projects for things like Sky, a big provider of media here in the UK. I think in Australia too, probably.
Yeah.
We also had worked with NHS here in the UK.
Yeah.
So I think 2 years ago, we had a team working on an app for the NHS. And again, the idea is these sort of projects is that there was 4 or 5 students working on them for 2 trimesters for a third of their time. So it's been aware the amount of person time there is reasonable. It's a lot more than you get in an individual student project, but in terms of software development terms, it's quite limited still.
Just coordinating getting a project that is going to last, I mean, that's kind of a tough gig to get a project that's going to conform, that's big enough for 4 or 5 people to work on for 2 trimesters is I think it's a tough one. So well done on that. One of the questions that I have is, what was the commitment from the company? Did they have to have a project manager or anything like that sitting in with the team? How did that work?
So one thing we do is we have some kind of guidance notes to companies about what's expected if they want to do a project with us. Again, you're seeing where for many years we had companies coming to computer science. So I acted as industrial liaison for several years for the department. And companies come to you saying, "Can you build this software?" It's like, well, potentially, but is it something we should be building, or should we go to a company? And just to appreciate if we're trying to build something, how realistic is it we'll have a good solution for you? So it's putting that kind of reality, so expectation management that we try and do with companies. One of the things we do say is that if they want a project to run for us, they'll need to be able to work with us to define it sufficiently, as you say, so we can confirm it's going to be big enough, but not too big. And also, as you say, a key thing is though that they're the product owner, so they need to be able to come to us, and we sort of set a minimum expectation of what they should do interaction-wise, and also explain that we don't want too much interaction, but the more they can do that's helpful interaction, the more likely is we'll be able to give them a good solution. So in this project module, we have across 7 modules now, we've adopted Agile Methodology. Again, it's quite well known. I think the last 2 years, lots of people have said we're working in an agile way. I think that they tend to mean agile, I think in the language meaning of it, rather than formal agile project management. But we do agile project management.
Yeah.
So does that require that the project manager from the business attend the stand-ups and the retrospectives and all of the things that go along with agile, or?
To an extent. So if anyone listening who's not fully aware of it, in agile projects, you tend to have the idea that there's a project owner who talks about what they need, what they want. The team of developers, and again, these are intended for small projects, so 4 or 5 people, which is why it works well for our module. They work with that team in terms of what they want. The team then work on that in what's called a sprint. They identify what needs to be done, like a backlog of ideas, work through those, and then they'll have daily meetings as a team on development. And then at the end of the sprint period, which normally says is 1 or 2 weeks typically, they'll go through that with a product owner to see how far that's working and if you need to revise anything. So these kind of cyclic development cycles are quite short. They work well, say, for small to medium projects, but it does require that the project owner does get involved at the end of the sprints. So we tend to, with the company involvement, say if they can commit to some involvement at that point. It's not always in person. Again, with COVID last 2 years in particular, Teams has been a general way of managing a lot of these projects anyway. It doesn't always happen, and again, that's why we have our own sort of commercial manager running the module who can take some ownership of helping the team review progress if the external person isn't being as active as we'd like. Because obviously they're doing it in a sense they want a product from us if we can, but it's not a paid product. They're not contracted to us. We're not contracted to them either. There are contractual things sometimes, and we do non-disclosure agreements. If a company's got an idea for something, a person wants to develop a proof of concept on something innovative, we'll do an NDA, so that both our staff and students
Sure.
can't disclose that.
Sure.
But beyond that, we're not committing to creating something, and the client isn't committing to necessarily staying throughout. So we have a workaround that our commercial manager can take over, if you like, as a project owner.
Yeah.
If the external person isn't as active as we'd like. But generally speaking, that they tend to be certainly on like a 2-week or maybe occasionally a slightly longer cycle of giving input to the projects.
Yeah.
The agile teams are working through. And it's a good way to get the students to think about how projects work in practice, think about development.
Do you include across that development, you know, through the sprint cycles, do you include formative peer assessment?
At points, yes. So we've I think over years experimented with different levels of sort of formal, informal review of how the people are contributing. So we tend to use sort of a formal peer assessment at the end as part of that. Again, identifying marks for everyone. So it's a way to gather data on contribution. Because we're marking this module, we focus on the process for students. So they create a portfolio of what they've been doing. We look at the products, and the products are usually we do a presentation on projects to all the clients if they want to come along, and to others to see the kind of like showcase what we've done. Often we can build some very good software in what's quite a limited time period. But the process we're looking at in terms of assessment is more around the students' personal portfolios and assessments. But to supplement that, we have peer assessment, so they can identify then the different contributions. Yeah. But say alongside that, we often routinely do intermediate checks, which help us pick up on potential issues in teams. So because of the way the module runs, it tends to run with a fixed day a week, ideally, of when they should be doing it as a formal module. And we run that like an industrial location would be. So they should be there sort of 9 till 5. There are some breaks built into that. The commercial manager that we sort of employ, they come in to be available, going around the teams, checking on progress. The academics also available to, again, discuss issues and monitor progress. I'm
sorry. I was going to jump in. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting was that you said students can't take home work. That it's one day a week, and then they can't take it home. And I thought, well, I wonder why that is. But tell us why you came to that.
It was partly the sort of discipline of getting a lot of work environments that was limited to where you can do the work. I mean, partly reflects some of the technical needs, if you like, that we set up a lab for them to work on this. We can give them sort of bespoke software images and access to things which we limit to the time period. In practice, I think we allow a day and a half a week for the module. Again, notionally it's a third of their time, so a third of a week, let's say a day and a half. But the kind of the industrial modeling bit of it, you like, where it's like an industrial software lab, that's a day a week. So it's very much like going into a company. So I do a lot of industrial visits on placement students and other projects I've worked on, and our software lab on those days, you know, it looks like if you go into an industrial environment.
Well, each student has their own desk. Is that right? That's fixed. I mean, they have the fixed workstation. They're going to work.
That's right. Yeah. So again, apparently that's a practical thing, that the managing sort of software projects, there's a lot of complexities to the software image, to permissions and what they can do. So we found the best way for that was that they have a fixed computer available. Again, rooms configured so that there were kind of alcoves for teams. So a team is in an area, and also means the team can take some ownership of it. So in our commercial development lab, the walls have got project charts up, so they can maintain their information on the project management. You can see the sprint boards up, see the tasks moving forwards and backwards on them. So it's a place that they can actually identify and work on, because it's in a it's a lab we use for other teaching as well. But when they're in there on the day, they have their specific places. they have the areas of it which are theirs all the time. But yeah, the emphasis is that they should be working on it that primarily that day a week of the scheduled formal lab. I mean, a few hours on top of that to allow them to do some investigation and things, but not having that team place or the access to the same software and facilities. Partly it's also to help them manage their time, in that we don't want it to become that they find it so interesting or there's problems we're trying to deal with that it takes up too much time.
Yeah.
Because this is a third of their study period. I think if you're doing it as a block only, that would be different. I mean, you might even say you can do so much time you want on it. But I think if for discipline within their own learning as students, but also for going forward, I think having that clear demarcation between work and non-work is helpful.
Yeah.
Again, it's something that the industry can suffer from sometimes, is that people get expectations of working all hours. For times when you have crunch points. So again, it may be they do other work near a deadline, but we're trying to encourage them into good working practice, which is about work-life balance.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I want to find out what the results have been. But before I do that, you mentioned something interesting, that you assess the process rather than the product, which in so many cases, in capstone courses, the easy thing to do is to evaluate the product, right? Because you can put a rubric to that, and everybody knows what good code looks like, or what a good report or a good marketing plan or whatever it is that you're producing, that can be evaluated. When you said to the students, we're going to assess you on process, how did students react to that? Did they like that? Did that take a bit of pressure off?
I think they seem to like it. I'm sure it takes pressure off. It maybe helps them focus what it is they need to do. So I think often it's easier sometimes to assess a single sort of product, and then you can set a marking rubric and apply it to everybody in exactly the same way. And for these kind of reflective process accounts, you can still do a similar thing. So we have a clear marking guidance to them, what we're looking for into evidence in the portfolio, and in the presentation that they give us about their experience as well. So we do have a clear set of guidance, and we have a clear rubric for marking against on what to do. I think sometimes it's a little harder to apply that, or maybe it takes a bit more experience to apply that, because what we're looking at is that evidence. But it's something we have tried to build into earlier years as well, so that they're not entirely new to it, although it's maybe the first module where that's the sort of the main focus of our assessment. Again, I think a lot of maybe STEM subjects, we tend to focus on concrete results, like say a product, an output, an answer. Whereas this is more discursive about their experiences. But again, that's not unusual in many other disciplines where that's what they focus on. I also teach a module on teaching computing. So I get students going to schools locally and help in teaching computer science at school level. And their assessment then is about their portfolio of what they've done and understood and learned about it. So some students have met that before in other modules. And say we have tried to introduce it into earlier stages too, where a part of the honours project is reflection on what they've done. In other modules, where I've done team projects, partly to help with dealing with appeals and issues, is for all the students write reflective accounts on their experience of the project, what went well, what didn't go well, and what they actually did towards it, which then I use also to consider against the WebPA scores in a similar way we do in this module. So we have the personal accounts, and we can kind of validate them because we've seen the accounts from all the students in the team, and we've got peer assessment scores, which can indicate that this student says that they found it went well, they think they did a lot towards a project, they're a big contributor, and you should see that then in WebPA score. And if you don't, it gives you something to discuss with them. Why is it that your perception is so different from everybody else's?
Yes.
But again, because of this module, it's the main activity is sort of supervised learning, and the activity, we have a lot of experience of that directly.
Yeah.
But I think it does help, again, just gives you that way to sort of triangulate what they're saying.
Yeah. So we started with the big problem, which is the skills gap, and that happens to be for you, that you were graduating from computer science and it was hard to get a job. So your capstone course really addressed this. And so what are the results? Are your students getting work from this? Is this leading to direct employment? Are they happy with what they've done?
Absolutely. So again, it's maybe more sort of empirical evidence in a way, but and be careful of sort of cause and effect issues. What we found was that when we've looked at the data for the MN students who do this module compared to other students who don't, the employability rates have been much higher. We did a few years ago analyze some of the starting salaries, and we found the starting salaries were higher too. So they were getting jobs and getting better paid jobs. In many cases, we got job offers from the companies. So we had external companies they've been working with.
Hire direct.
It's quite often they get a job offer from them. Often the company wants to take the product forward. So it is working on in that sense. In a few cases, the students have actually, they've got on so well within their team and their ideas, they've gone off to form companies. So we've got a few local companies or small startups, which is 2 or 3 of the graduates from within the module, and we've got to know each other, setting up.
Nice.
So there's a lot of evidence of that. So I suppose one caveat to that evidence is the sort of students that choose to do a 4-year master's might be deemed better performers than students who have not chosen that route. So it's there's that caveat that we can't say for definite, but the increase in employability, the increase in salary, and for our own experience of the students, I think it does seem to show it works well and has value added for them. So we do it at the master's level. You could apply it earlier. We've talked about doing that type of module in level 3 at the honours stage in the 3rd year. Again, partly because of numbers and partly managing it, we decided not to at this point. But it is, I think it's applicable as an idea.
That's
at a range of levels.
Pete's been thinking about teamwork across the curriculum.
I think that the idea of scaffolding, both the reflective learning reports that you're talking about and peer assessment, these are not things you can just introduce at the very end of a program, and it's an utterly new kind of assessment that the students ever experienced before. And it sounds like you're doing that with the reflective learning, and to some extent with the peer assessment as well. So I think we agree on that one. We've got one of our clients, one of the universities, their engineering faculty has introduced teammate peer assessment at level 1. Yeah, the first year. So they are committed to this idea of developing and providing evidence that's very good evidenced development of these teamwork capabilities or employability capabilities, future ready capabilities. These are some of the terms that we are using, and they are measuring those against I think the Dublin Accord, the Washington Accord, where they explicitly have to say as an institution how we meet those requirements of the Dublin Accord, the Washington Accord, and the Quality Assurance Association, the UK one. It sounds like a similar sort of scheme to which you've got to align. I wanted to just give some feedback as part of the conversation about what I thought were the standout strengths of what you've done, having worked in kind of experiential learning, adventure learning myself, and the phrase that immediately struck out for me is something. What you've done is you've isomorphically framed a real software development agency. It's more than an incubator. And if you're not familiar with the term isomorphically framed, you've made learning elements, experiential elements, and you've modeled them against the real world. And you've taken some really interesting real world elements, that discipline, that constraint on this is A, where you will work, and B, there's a limit on the time, and no overtime or limited overtime. The other thing, which we haven't talked about so far, but I noticed, and I noticed it because I have been a client of one of these student teams, not one of your student teams, but a student team from a university. And I experienced where this didn't quite happen. And this is the notion that you're not just solving a computer science problem, but the software must be production ready. And you said that concentrated and energized the team to produce a high quality solution. And by production ready, that means that you have got to have worked through what we call in our business the staging cycle, the acceptance at the end of staging before it goes into production, and the post-production re-acceptance to make sure that it works there. And we're just a little company, and we've learnt those things. And our student team, they solved the technical problem, and they didn't quite they left too little time to get it through our chief developer to solve all the problems that he wanted solving before he was able to issue what he called a pull request to bring it into the mainstream. It didn't get there, but the students started to learn it, and their teacher started to learn it, and yeah, that was the point. Real external clients and prospective employers as formative mentors and not assessors. I like that. And you had both your internal commercial development manager acting as a proxy sometimes for the real client. So there was always that availability there at the sprint retros. And I'm absolutely committed to this idea of assessing processes and practices, not just the delivery of the code. I accidentally discovered the value of that when I ran a course on innovation, and I said it's going to demonstrate innovation, and I gave 1/4 of the marks to output, 1/4 to a documentation of the process that you used and what you would do if you had more time or more resources, another 1/4 for creative display of the output, and another 1/4 was just the reflective essay critique component. So that was radical, and boy, did I get fabulous productions, way beyond a report. I got, all sorts of artifacts. Yeah. So those are some of the key things that I saw there. Yeah.
Well, we're past the hour, and so that means that it's almost our bedtime, and it's probably time for Neil to get to work.
But he may have some questions for us.
Sure. So
Yeah,
Neil,
thanks.
go ahead.
Well, thank you both. It's been nice to have the opportunity to talk about what we've done. Sometimes, again, we don't always reflect ourselves on what we do and why we do it. It's interesting to hear some of your own experiences there as well. I think going forward, I think it was good to share different practices, different ways to practically do that. I think the things you experienced, Peter, with if you give students the opportunity to shine, they will. And I think often we limit it a little bit. So I think if we can find ways that are more open and that we can assess the things that will matter for them and really matter for us in the longer term is really important. So I think there's a lot of scope there. I think the team activity and peer assessment is something which it's been known about for, say, a few decades and has been developing, but I think it still isn't accepted fully. You see so many learning environments that don't support it. So we need external tools still to help. And I guess that comes back to some of your work as well. That so WebPA that I've been using for some time, it's got some development happening still, but it struggles because it has no funding. It was a part of its remit was to show potential. The funding it had was quite short-lived. Beyond that, it's been community support only, which has enabled some continuation of it, but it does limit capacity to develop it and to deploy it. So a lot of institutions, I think, are interested in that idea of a peer assessment approach for these sort of team activities, but they struggle to get the technology set up. I think that nowadays, a lot of institutions are wanting services they can buy in or pay for separately. So I think, again, for myself, looking forward, I'm looking at platforms like PeerAssess Pro and others that could let us do that. At some point, I was fearful that your current one will get turned off. I think it's just to go back. Maybe the final challenge for any kind of innovation in teaching is this: if I develop my approach to teaching assessment around this technology,
is it going to be there?
Is it going to be there? And I think where we've suffered again, I think in the sector a lot, kind of service level agreements and long-standing agreements aren't always there. So often we're given, sometimes you get a demo of here's technology which you could use it next year. Like, well, I could, but it would take me weeks of redeveloping my course, and will it exist in 2 years' time?
Yeah.
I think that can be a challenge to people being willing to take it up as well, is finding stable platforms that integrate easily, and where this thing has got a sufficient lifespan, but I could build it into my approach. So I'll hand that back over to you.
Well, we look forward to giving you a demo on that.
Well, thanks you both.
Perfect.
I'll let you both get ready if you're going to bed.
Thank you.
Right.
Have a
Nice
lovely
talking,
day and a lovely weekend.
Yes, you too.
Yes.
Great.
Take care.
Thanks, indeed.
Nice to meet
Thanks
you.
so much, Neil. Really valued that
Yes.
conversation.